Kesubos Daf Nun Tes contains one Mishnah, two primary sugyas. The first half of the daf is about the financial obligations that a man and woman who are married have to each other. The second half of the daf is about the services that a woman provides for her husband when she is obligated to provide them, when she is no longer obligated to provide them. So let's learn the first half of the daf. We have two sugyas within it. We have a mini sugya discussion between Machlokas Rav and Shmuel, which service, which financial support that the husband provides is in exchange for which that the wife provides. Then we have a Machlokas between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yochanan Sandler. What happens when she's makdish? When he's makdish, is it chal? And this will take us into a statement of Shmuel how to paskin. The Gemara asks a steer in Shmuel and give four answers, very much around the sugya of davar shalei bala elam. So let's begin. So as we've said, as we've learned in the past, there are two types of financial support that the husband is obligated to his wife, and two types of work, of earnings, that the woman gives to her husband in exchange. The two types of financial support that the husband gives his wife, one is mizonos, that is a amount that she needs for her basic necessities, including food and other basic human necessities that he has to give her. And then there's a silver ma, a fixed amount that he gives her for spending money every week. Now, the two things that the woman gives her husband are a minimum amount that she has to work to give him, which is in exchange for one of those two. We'll see in Machokas which one. That minimum amount is to be able to make thread that's used for warps, used for the chassis of the garment, which is in the amount of weight of 5 slime of the measures in Yehuda. Very specific amount of chazal or metakin she has to work. Beyond that, if she works and earns more than that, she gives that to her husband as well, but that's considered a separate payment. So we have two things, mizonos and the silver ma, and we have the required work that she does and beyond the required work. Which is in exchange for which? So the Gemara says, it's machlokes between Rav and Shmuel and Rav Ada bar Ava. Rav Ada bar Ava says the mizonos is in exchange for the extra work, and the silver ma is in exchange for the required work. Now we have a brisa that seems to say otherwise. The brisa says clearly tiknu mizonos tachas maaseh yadayim. The maaseh yadayim is in exchange for the mizonos, not the silver ma. So you have to change tiknu mizonos tachas moser maaseh yadayim. It's the extra work. And that's how that fits in. Now the Gemara has a very similar exchange in Rav and Shmuel. Rav and Shmuel hold that the mizonos is in exchange for the required ma'aseh yadayim, and the silver ma is in exchange for the extra. Gemara says the kash is that we have a brisa that says that if he's not giving her the silver ma, she gets to keep her own ma'aseh yadayim. Seems to show that the silver ma is in exchange for the ma'aseh yadayim, not for the extra. So Gemara says you have to add the word moser again. You have to say it's referring to the extra. Gemara says, I have a kasha on that. In that very same brisa, it defines for us what the requirement is. What are the 5 slime? It tells us what the 5 slime is. That sounds like when it says ma'aseh yadayim, it's talking about the required. Gemara says, no, because by defining 5 slime, you also define what the extra is. You define anything beyond that is extra. So it's telling me what the required is, nor do they understand what the extra is, and that's what's really in exchange for the silver ma that he gives her for spending money. All right, now the Gemara discusses how we paskin in the machlokas between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yochanan Sandler. In our last Mishnah, we saw the question of what happens if a man is makdish his wife's earnings. So we saw that Rabbi Meir said that it's hektish, it's chal, it works, and Yochanan Sandler said that no, it's chulin, it doesn't work. And Shmuel there had explained the pshat of Yochanan Sandler is that we're talking about where the husband is inheriting her ma'aseh yadayim after she dies. We're not talking about what he's getting from her while she's earning it. That she has a right to possibly pull out, and therefore he doesn't really own it. She owns it. Talking about what he inherits after she dies. If he inherits after she dies, why can't he be makdish it? Because at the time that he's being makdish it doesn't exist yet. It's not his right yet. She didn't die yet. He didn't inherit it. And it's what's called a davar shalei bala elam. So Shmuel said, Pshat and Rabbi Yochanan Sandler is that you cannot be makdish something which does not exist yet, something which is futures. You can't be makdish futures. So Gemara now brings that Shmuel paskins like Rabbi Yochanan Sandler, which seems to mean that Shmuel l'shita is saying that, like Rav Yochanan Sandler said, you cannot be makdish on davar shalei bala elam. Gemara says we have a kasha that Shmuel doesn't seem to say the way. Shmuel seems to hold you could be makdish davar shalei bala elam. The Gemara is going to bring a brisa that shows us that, and then the Gemara is going to show 4 ways to try to fit Shmuel into these two things that Shmuel holds in this brisa that you can't be makdish in this Mishnah you can't be makdish davar shelo ba'olam. On the other hand, the Brisa seems to say you could be makdish davar shelo ba'olam. Now, where's that Brisa? It's actually a Mishnah, the Gemara says. The Mishnah discusses what happens when a woman is makdish her ma'aseh yadayim against her husband, but she's not makdish it, she asers it to him. I mean, that is, she makes a neder, and she says that my ma'aseh yadayim are konum, they're like a carbon. Konum is a manipulation of the word carbon. They're like a carbon to you, meaning her husband is forbidden to benefit from her ma'aseh yadayim. So the question is that chal? If it's chal, so then he could be made for it. But is there any validity to it? Does he even have to be made for it? So that would depend on, does she own her own ma'aseh yadayim? Similar to when the husband was makdish, which we discussed in our last Mishnah. Here we're discussing, does she own it or not? So the Gemara brings a three-way machlekes tanaim. Rabbi Akiva, so we have the Tanakama who says she doesn't own it, he doesn't have to be made for it, there's no validity. Rabbi Akiva says he should be made for it because he's only considered owning what she's required to give him. What she's not required to give him, the extra, she doesn't have to work. Therefore, she doesn't have to give it to him. Therefore, you can't look at it as if he owns it. She really owns it, and therefore, when she asers it on him, itaka becomes aser. So, in order to avoid that becoming aser, he has to be made for it. Then you have the opinion of Yochanan ben Nuri, who says you should be made for it, but for a different reason, and that's because what happens if they get divorced? Any ma'aseh yadayim that she earns afterwards is definitely not his property. She doesn't owe it to him. So then any additional ma'aseh yadayim from that point on will be aser. Now it will be aser to him, to the husband, to the former husband. Now you'll ask, who cares? They're not married anymore. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says, but they may one day get remarried, and now have a problem. Or they want to get remarried, and they can't. Because she won't be able to do anything for him, because all her ma'aseh yadayim now have an iser chal. He wasn't made for it. This doesn't belong to him, so the Isser is chal on these ma'aseh yadayim after they get divorced, which are no longer his property. So that she was makdish or that she asered him, she said konum is chal on it, and now he can't marry her anymore. They will lose the option of remarriage. Says Shmuel, the halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Now here you have a clear case of him being makdish davar shelo ba'olam. The whole concern, according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, is the earnings that she's going to have after they get divorced. They're not divorced now. It's not her property. It's his property. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri seems to be clearly agreeing that as of now it's his property. His only concern is when they get divorced, it'll be her property and it'll become aser. But she's not being makdish then; she's being makdish now. Obviously, Shmuel holds that the fact that it's a davar shelo ba'olam is not a problem. You could be makdish a davar shelo ba'olam, and it is chal. So then how could he pass like Rabbi Yochanan Asandler in our Mishnah that says that it's what the husband's makdish is not chal because it's a davar shelo ba'olam? Which is it? You could be makdish davar shelo ba'olam or you can't. This is the Gemara's contradiction. Now the Gemara is going to try to give 4 approaches to answer this. Answer number 1, the Gemara quotes without a name. The Gemara says that Shmuel is not really passing like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Shmuel is just saying the same halacha as Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, but for a different reason. Shmuel is saying it's because we're afraid for the extra that she's going to make. The money that she's going to earn extra above the 5 slime, it'll be chal, the iser konam on that. But really, he does not agree with Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri because he holds that a person cannot be makdish davar shelo ba'olam. So Gemara asks, how is that makes sense? If that's what Shmuel holds, then he's pretty much saying Rabbi Akiva's shita. So he should say, I pass like Rabbi Akiva. Why is he saying I pass like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri? Also, he could go like the Tanakama and say the halacha is not like the Tanakama. The Tanakama said he doesn't have to be made for. He could say you do have to be made for. But if he's not saying like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, he shouldn't say like Rabbi Yochanan. He should not. He's phrasing completely wrong. Rashi points out that you have another kasha here. This still is a davar shelo ba'olam. The extra that she's going to earn above the 5 slime is also not ba'olam. The Gemara could have asked that also, but the Gemara had a different kasha to ask anyway. So the Gemara gives the second answer, and that's Rav Yosef. And Rav Yosef says it's the difference between the 2 types of cases. Our Mishnah, the case of Rav Yochanan Sandler, is talking about where the man was makdishit l'gevaya, makdishit to the Beis Hamikdash. Here she wasn't makdish, she said konam. She made a neder and she asered it. There's a big difference between the 2, and that's that konam only becomes aser to one person. She's saying it's aser to you. It's very different than when she's becoming hekdesh to the Beis Hamikdash is becoming aser to everyone. Why is that significant? Because the hektish to you, to one person, is a weaker hektish, and therefore it's easier for it to be chal. It could even be chal on something which isn't yours. You could say that somebody else's property is usher to me. So you're asking somebody else's things. You can't be makdish somebody else's things to the Beis Hamikdash. Now, since you have a right to aser someone else's property, you also have a right to aser davar shelo b'olam. It's very similar kind of thing. Someone else's property is not yours, it's not in your control, and a davar shelo b'olam is not yours, it's not in your control. So hektish, the case of Yochanan Sandler, you can't do on a shelo b'olam just like you can't do it on somebody else's property. You can't be makdish somebody else's things. Konam, where you're making a neder, you could aser someone else's property. Therefore, you could also make that neder iser on something which is not b'olam. So the Gemara rejects this. Abaye asks, it's very different. You can only aser it on yourself. The factor that's common here, you're not controlling other person's property, you're controlling yourself. You're saying I could aser myself. I could say that someone else's things are aser to me, or I could say that my things are aser to someone else. You want to do to say that a davar shelo b'olam could become aser, that's like saying your uncle's property is aser to Shmerel, his to him. That's something you have no control over. That's like a davar shelo b'olam. That you can't do. Even in Kohen, you can't do that. So therefore, this doesn't make sense. So the Gemara therefore has to go to its third answer. So the Gemara says that the case over here is not really where she said konam. It's where she said yiktishu yodai lo'isam. She was saying that I'm being makdish, I'm being konam my hands. I'm answering my hands. Since my hands are also to my husband, anything that they produce are also to my husband as well. So the Gemara asks, how could she answer her hands to him? He owns her hands. He owns the rights to what her hands produce. Gemara says she's saying that my hands will become hektish, will become konam when we get divorced. So she's saying on her hands which exist now, will become konam when we get divorced. So Gemara says, is there such a thing as a delayed chal iser konam? Could you do such a thing? And the Gemara now proceeds to try to show that you could. And the Gemara is going to try to see how could you compare, to what could you compare this case of delayed hektish. Does it work? Could you be makdish something which you don't have control over right now, that it should take effect in the future? Similar to a davar shelo b'olam concept, but more focusing on being makdish the hands which are there now. The Gemara now goes through 5 different opinions as to what could we compare this case of where the woman's being makdish her hands after they get divorced, so she gets control over her hands. And therefore, should this hektish be chal or not? So Rabbi Eloi says, yes, it should be chal. It's very similar to a case of somebody who owns a field, and he sells it. And he says, as he owns it, he says, I'm going to sell it to you. He says to someone, I'm going to sell it to you, and I'm being makdish it now, that when I buy it back, it should be chal the hektish. So you see that it could be delayed hektish could be chal, and therefore, the woman could also be makdish her hands later when she'll get divorced. So the Gemara pushes this other. The Gemara says it's not comparable. Over there, he's being makdish while he has control over it. He has his field. Our case, she doesn't have her hands yet. She's going to get it soon. It's comparable, instead, says the Gemara, to a case where he already sold the field, and it says, I'm going to be makdish when I buy it. There, the hektish is not chal, so here it shouldn't be chal either. So the Gemara says, no, that's not a correct comparison either. Because in the case where he sold the field, he has zero control over it. He doesn't own the field, and he doesn't own the property. He doesn't own the fruits that grow from the field. This woman owns her own body. She's in control of her body. She doesn't own the rights to production of her hand. That she has to give to her husband. But the body is hers. It's under her control. So therefore, she should have a right to be makdish it. It's not the same as that case. Over there, it doesn't work because he can't be makdish it while he doesn't own the field. That it should be chal when he buys it, because he has zero ownership, he has zero rights to it at all. Here she has some. So the Gemara says that Rav Papa therefore says that it's comparable to a case where the field is a mashgon. So you don't have control over the payros of the production of the field, but you do own the body of the field itself. And that's this woman has control over her. She owns her body, but she doesn't have control over the production of the body. Now over there, it is hektish if she's makdish it. If you're makdish a field which is a mashgon, which is a collateral. So therefore this should work also. You should be able to makdish this. The Gemara says again that this is not a good comparison, because in the case of the field that's a mashkon, you have control. You could redeem it at any time and get rights to the fruits. This woman cannot get her hands back if she wants. She can't divorce herself. She can't force a divorce, and therefore she has no way to get control of her hands. Therefore, she's in a much weaker position. So over there, in the case of the field that's a mashkon, it works for the owner to be makdish it because he could get control. Over here, she can't get control, and therefore the hektish should not work. So on that thing, Gemara says, it can be similar to a case where a field is a mashkon and it's put aside, mortgaged for a minimum of 10 years. So you can't redeem it now. So this woman also can't redeem herself now. So Gemara says it's still not comparable, because over there at least you could redeem it after 10 years. Here she can never force herself to get redeemed at any time. Therefore the Gemara says it's not comparable, and we're going to reject this entire approach. The woman cannot be makdish her hands now for when she's going to have it redeemed later, because you can't make something for a delayed result. So the Gemara says we need to go back to our question then. What is the difference between konam and real hektish? So the Gemara brings its fourth answer, which is Rav Ashi. And the Gemara says the difference is because this konam is kedushas haguf. It's the body of the object itself becomes iser. It's different than the hektish, where if somebody's makdish a thing, it just becomes kedushas hadamim. The monetary value goes to hektish. Hektish doesn't. It's not that it changes the body of the object, it's just the hektish owns it, and hektish can sell it and use the profits. Here, when somebody says konam, he's making the body of the thing into actual iser, as if he made it into a carbon. That's similar to hektish in the sense where you have hektish kedushas haguf, where you take an animal and make it a carbon. There, the body of the thing becomes iser. So Gemara says this is similar to a statement we have in the name of Rava that there are three ways to take a shibud off. There are three ways you can change the body of something and you can knock off the mortgage that's on it, the lien, the hold that's on it. And therefore here, konam, which is one of them, knocks off the husband's property. The husband has rights to her ma'aseh yadayim. You can push off that claim on it by making the thing itself konam. What are those three ways to push off a shibud on something? So the Gemara refers to a case where someone simply has shibud on land. Someone owes him money and he has the rights to collect from the property. There's even an apoteki on certain things that this specific object that the borrower has is the obligation is to pay from that. But there's three ways to take it off. One is if you're makdish to kedushas haguf, it itself belongs to hektish now, and therefore any shibud that was on it falls off. So here also, if she's makdish, not really makdish, but kona, makdish to her husband, makdish away from her husband, her ma'aseh yadayim, his shibud falls off. The other case is if it becomes chametz on Pesach, it becomes a real iser, and therefore it's valueless. And the last case is if it's an eved, that you're meshacher, you free it, that takes off any shibud that was on it beforehand. Mara asks if that's what's happening, she's really konam, she's really makdish and iser, and it knocks off all the husband's shibudim, then it should be chal right away. Why does it have to wait until they get divorced? Why does Shmuel Paskin, like Rav Yochanan ben Nuri, that after they get divorced, that's where you have a problem, and that's where it'll be chal? So Mara says because the Chachamim gave extra strength to the shibud of the Baal that it can actually override this. But that's only while they are married. Once they get divorced, then this thing is chal, this hektish is chal. We now begin the next Mishnah, which discusses the services that a woman provides for her husband. So before we begin the Mishnah, let's just mention that the Gemara says this Mishnah is not going to go according to Rabbi Chia. Rabbi Chia holds that a woman does not provide any services for her husband. A woman is for beauty, for children, and to wear jewelry. She has rights, she has no obligations. A man should give her jewelry to look pretty, and that's it. Rishonim point out that Rabbi Chia used to buy wonderful things for his wife all the time, even though she was very cruel to him, and that he would say that it's enough what they do for us, that they save us from chait and take away, and they bring us children, so therefore they have no other obligations. Now, the Chachamim, which is in this Mishnah, have a list of 7 obligations that she has. So, first of all, and it changes if she brought in servants into the marriage. If she had servants beforehand, then her requirements drop. So if she brought in no servants, so she has to grind. The Gemara says either she could, the phrase she grinds is a bit misleading. She just has to put the grain into the grinder, which is turned by water usually. If she wants, she can use a hand grinder, and then maybe that's what the Mishnah means when it says she grinds. But chiyuv number 1 is that she grinds. Chiyuv number 2 is that she makes food to bake in the oven. Chiyuv 3 is that she cleans, she does the laundry. Chiyuv 4 is she cooks. Chiyuv 5 is she nurses the children, the babies. And we'll point out that Beis Shammai disagrees. Beis Shammai holds she doesn't have to. Chiyuv number 6 is that she makes the bed, and chiyuv number 7, the Gemara says, is that she makes woolen things. Now, if she brought one servant into the marriage, that takes off her obligation to grind, to bake, and to do laundry. If she brought 2 servants, that also takes off her obligation to cook and to nurse a child. If she brought a 3rd servant, the Chachamim say she doesn't have to make the bed and she doesn't have to do tzemer. And if she brought a 4th, the Chachamim say she just sits and she doesn't even have to bring something upstairs for her husband. According to Rabbi Eliezer, however, you always have to do something. She always has to do tzemer. She always has to do woolen work, because if she's going to have nothing to do, then boredom brings to zima, it brings to sin. Shimon ben Gamliel says, for that reason, if somebody tells his wife she doesn't have to work at all, or if he makes a neder that he's not going to be neder from her work, then he has to divorce her and give her a ksuba, because he can't live like that. Not having what to do drives people up the walls. Now, the Gemara quotes from Rav Chia, somebody who wants to make his wife's countenance glow should give her beautiful flax clothing. Somebody who wants to whiten the skin of his daughter should give her young birds to eat and milk to drink close to her physical time of maturity. All right, now let's see the Gemara. The Gemara focuses, after the things which we've quoted already, the Gemara focuses on what happens when a woman makes a neder that she's not going to nurse the child. So it seems to be a neder against her obligation. She's obligated to nurse the child. So it's a machlokes between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. Beis Shammai says you take the nurse away from the child. The expression that's used is she removes the breast from his mouth, because she said she's not going to nurse him, so she's not obligated to. She doesn't have to nurse him. Beis Hillel says no, you force her to, because she's obligated to. It's one of her obligations, and therefore the neder is not chal. Now, if he divorces her, then she's no longer obligated. But if the child will nurse from anybody else because he recognizes his mother, then he has to pay her, and then she's forced to do it she's forced to accept the payment and to do it, because otherwise the child will die. Now the Gemara's question is, could this fit in our Mishnah? Our Mishnah had clearly said that she is obligated to nurse the child. Beis Shammai seems to be saying she's not obligated. So the Gemara wants to say maybe it fits in the Mishnah. And Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai are not arguing as to whether or not there's an obligation. They're arguing as to whether or not the husband lost his obligation, because the husband was mekayim her neder. He could have been meifir the neder. So Beis Shammai holds it's the husband's problem, and therefore he lost his rights. And Beis Hillel say it's the wife's problem, and therefore he didn't lose any rights. Gemara says this can't be correct, because if that was pshat in the brisa, why are we talking about nursing? If we wanted to argue about whether he loses his rights or not, talk about a ksuba, the rights of the ksuba. Did she lose the ksuba rights or not? That would be a simple neder that she could make that would show us whether or not she's responsible for a neder she made, or he's responsible for not being meifir the neder. Second of all, we have a brisa that says Beis Shammai says clearly she does not have to nurse the child if she doesn't want to. So the Gemara therefore says that Beis Shammai does not go like our Mishnah. Our Mishnah holds that she's obligated to, and Beis Shammai holds that she doesn't have to.